It started like any other evening. He was scrolling through his phone, half listening to the music playing in the background, when a message popped up. At first, he almost ignored it, just another notification. But then he saw the name. His heart skipped a beat. It was her. The girl he had once taken for granted. The one who used to wait for his calls, his texts, his time. And now she was the one reaching out. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, a flood of emotions hitting him all at once. It had been months since they last spoke. Back then, he had been the one in control, the one who decided when and if they talked. She had always been there, patient, understanding, forgiving even when he didn't deserve it. He had assumed she always would be. Until one day, she wasn't. He could still remember the last conversation they had. It wasn't anything dramatic. No big fight, no angry words. Just distance. He had grown used to her waiting for him to show up, to care, to put in the effort. And she had for so long. But then something shifted. The messages slowed. The calls stopped. And then, just like that, she was gone. He had told himself it didn't matter. That she'd be back. That she was just trying to prove a point, and when she was done, she'd come running back like she always did. But she didn't. Days turned into weeks, then months. And he had too much pride to reach out first. He convinced himself he was fine. But now, seeing her name on his screen, something inside him twisted. Why now? What did she want? His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could respond right away. Act casual. Or he could wait, make her wonder, like she had once made him. But deep down, he knew this time. It was different. This wasn't her trying to fix things or chase after him. This was her, on her own terms. And as he finally opened the message, he realized something he never thought he would. She wasn't the same person who used to wait for him. She wasn't looking for his approval anymore. This time, she was calling the shots. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, rereading the message, half expecting it to disappear. It was short. Too short. Just a simple, "Hey, hope you're doing well." That was it. No explanation. No anger. No hint of regret. Just a message that felt casual, too casual. But he knew better. There had to be something behind it. People didn't just come back like this after months of silence. He started typing, then deleted the words. He wasn't sure what to say. Did he act indifferent? Like he barely noticed her absence? Or did he ask the question burning in his mind, why now? Instead, he typed something safe. "Hey, been a while." Then he hit send before he could overthink it. A few minutes passed. He kept his phone in his hand, pretending not to care. But he wasn't fooling himself. He wanted to know what she had to say. Was she checking in? Trying to reopen a door she once walked away from? Or had she already moved so far past him that this message meant nothing? His thoughts spiraled as he waited, every second stretching longer. The truth was, he hadn't allowed himself to think about her for months. Not really. Not in a way that made him question his own actions. He had told himself she'd come back eventually, that she needed space. But now, as he sat there, his stomach tight, he wondered if he had been wrong. Then his phone vibrated again. Another message. "Yeah, it has. How have you been?" It was a normal question. The kind people asked when they were catching up. But something about it felt off. Like she wasn't really asking just to make conversation. He typed back quickly. "I've been good. Busy. You?" There was a longer pause this time, but not too long. Then, "Same. Just figuring things out." Figuring things out. He frowned at the words. It wasn't much of an answer, but it told him one thing: she wasn't here to reminisce. She wasn't being nostalgic. If anything, she sounded like someone who had already moved forward. And maybe that's what made his chest tighten the most. Back when she was always waiting for him, things had been simple. He never worried about losing her. She had been the one to hold on, to care more, to reach out first. But now, he wasn't sure where he stood with her. And for the first time, that bothered him. He hesitated before typing again. Glad to hear that. What made you reach out? This time, the response took longer. He watched the little typing bubble appear, then disappear, then appear again. She was thinking, choosing her words carefully. Finally, the reply came. I just wanted to say, hi. See how you're doing. It was polite, friendly, but distant. He stared at the message, feeling something shift inside him. This wasn't the girl who used to drop everything for him. This wasn't the girl who had once put his needs before her own. And that's when he realized she wasn't just reaching out to him. She was showing him something. She had changed. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. He ran a hand through his hair, still staring at the screen. She was playing it cool, but he knew there was more beneath the surface. He just didn't know if he wanted to dig into it or let it go. A few months ago, he wouldn't have thought twice about leaving her message on read. He would have assumed she'd follow up, send another text, maybe even call. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure she would. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Finally, he replied, It's good to hear from you. Simple. Safe. He wanted to see what she'd do next. But this time, there was no immediate response. The minutes stretched on, and eventually, he sighed, tossing his phone onto the couch beside him. He told himself he didn't care. That it didn't matter if she replied or not. But he was lying. He picked up his phone more times than he'd like to admit that night, checking for her name on his screen. But nothing came. She had sent the last message, and now she was the one leaving him waiting. And maybe that was the real reason he couldn't stop thinking about her. The next morning, he woke up with a familiar weight in his chest. He had spent so much time convincing himself that she was just another part of his past, someone who had walked away because she couldn't handle the way he was. But what if that wasn't true? What if she had simply realized she deserved more? That thought unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. He hesitated before sending another message. He didn't want to seem too eager, but he also didn't want the conversation to die. So he went with something casual. By the way, I saw something the other day that reminded me of you. It wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't a lie either. And if he was being honest with himself, she had never really left his mind to begin with. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. And then finally, his phone vibrated. Oh yeah? What was it? It was a small win, but it felt bigger than it should have. He smiled slightly, typing back. A little cafe we used to go to. Didn't even realize how much time had passed since the last time we were there. She didn't respond right away. He imagined her reading it, thinking about all the times she had sat across from him in that tiny place, waiting for him to look up from his phone, to fully be there with her. Then, finally, her reply came. Yeah. Feels like forever ago. Short. But there was something in it. Not nostalgia, exactly. Something else. Something unreadable. And suddenly, he needed to know more. We should catch up, he typed, before he could overthink it. He stared at the message, debating if he should delete it. But before he could make a decision, the dots appeared on the screen. She was already typing. And whatever she was about to say, he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. There was a long pause before her next message came through. I don't know if that's a good idea. He stared at the words, his stomach twisting. It wasn't what he expected. He had assumed she'd agree, maybe with hesitation, maybe with some walls up, but still agree. But this felt like rejection. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind racing for the right response. He could play it cool, brush it off like it didn't matter. Or he could ask her straight up what had changed. Why was she the one pulling away now? In the end, he settled for something in the middle. Why not? A full minute passed. Then another. He felt ridiculous for waiting so anxiously, but he couldn't look away from the screen. Finally, she replied, "I just think we're in different places now." Different places. He frowned. That was vague. Too vague. And for the first time, he started to wonder if this wasn't just about catching up. Maybe she wasn't reaching out to reconnect. Maybe she was reaching out to close the door for good. That thought didn't sit well with him. "You don't even want to grab coffee," he typed. "Just as friends?" The word friends felt strange, even as he wrote it. He wasn't sure if that's what he wanted, or if he was just trying to keep her from slipping away entirely. This time, her response was quicker. "It's not that I don't want to. I just don't think it would be the same." That hit differently. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent so much time assuming she'd always be there, waiting for him, wanting him. And now, for the first time, it felt like she had truly moved on. Not just from him, but from the version of herself that used to need him. And he wasn't sure how to handle that. "I get it," he finally replied. It was a lie, but what else could he say? She didn't respond right away. And for a second, he wondered if that was it. If this was how their story ended, just a slow fade into silence. But then, one final message came through. "I hope you're doing okay." Really. It was kind, sincere, and somehow that made it worse. He wanted to type something back. Something that would make her stay in this conversation just a little longer. But he knew nothing he said would change the way things had shifted between them. So instead, he did something he never thought he would. He left her on read. And for the first time, he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. He put his phone down, but his mind wouldn't let it go. The words lingered, looping in his head. "I don't think it would be the same." He had spent months convincing himself that she would come back, that when she did, things would just pick up where they left off. But now, for the first time, he had to face a truth he had been avoiding. She wasn't the same. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't either. That thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Because if she had changed, then that meant he had lost something. And if he had lost something, it meant he had never really had control in the first place. The next few days felt strange. He kept checking his phone, expecting another message, another opening, but nothing came. She had reached out first, but now she was the one pulling away. And the worst part, she wasn't doing it to play games. She wasn't waiting for him to chase her. She had simply let go. That realization hit him in unexpected moments, while he was making coffee, while he was out with friends, while he was lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. And every time it did, it left a strange, empty feeling in his chest. One evening, he found himself parked outside the cafe. The same one he had mentioned in their conversation. He didn't even remember deciding to come here. His feet just led him inside, like some part of him needed to see it, to remember. The place hadn't changed much. The same warm lighting, the same quiet hum of conversation. But the feeling was different. He had sat at that corner table with her more times than he could count, but he had never really been there. Not the way she had. He could still picture it. Her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she talked about her day. The way her eyes would flicker with hope every time he laughed at one of her jokes, as if she was still trying to figure out how much space she was allowed to take in his world. And now, she wasn't trying anymore. He ordered a coffee, not because he wanted one, but because he didn't know what else to do. As he waited, his eyes drifted to the entrance, and then just for a second, his breath caught. It was her. She hadn't seen him yet. She was standing near the door, scrolling through her phone, a slight crease in her brow, like she was waiting for someone. And then, as if feeling his stare, she looked up. For a second, neither of them moved. There was no dramatic reaction, no surprise. Just recognition. A quiet, undeniable understanding. Then she smiled. Not the way she used to, not the small, uncertain smile she had given him before. This one was different. Light. Free. And for the first time, he realized she wasn't waiting for him anymore. She walked past him without hesitation, heading toward a table near the window. A moment later, someone else walked in. A guy. He was smiling at her as he sat down, and she smiled back in a way that made something twist inside his chest. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was something else, something deeper. Regret. He could have looked away, could have walked out, pretended he didn't care. But he didn't. He stayed, his coffee growing cold in front of him, watching as she laughed at something the other guy said. She was different. And for the first time, he had to ask himself a question he had been avoiding since the moment her name appeared on his phone. Had she changed? Or had she just finally stopped waiting for someone who was never really there? And worse, was it already too late for him to do anything about it? He should have left, walked out, thrown his coffee away, and forgotten he ever saw her. But he couldn't. His body felt rooted to the chair, his fingers tightening around the cup as he watched her from across the cafe. She looked different. Not in the way that time changes a person, but in a way that made him realize she had been changing all along. He just never noticed. The way she held herself, the way she laughed so easily, like she wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. Like she wasn't waiting for him. The guy sitting across from her leaned in slightly, saying something that made her smile. And he felt something burn in his chest. He didn't even know if this guy was anything more than a friend, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she had moved forward, while he had been standing still, convinced she'd always be where he left her. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting what exactly? A message from her? A sign that this wasn't real? But it was nothing important. Just a notification. Something meaningless. Unlike this moment. He didn't know what came over him, but suddenly he was standing up. His heart pounded as he moved toward her table, every step feeling like a line he was crossing without knowing if he could go back. She looked up just as he reached them, and for a second, there was something unreadable in her expression. Surprise, maybe even hesitation, but not the kind he had been hoping for, not the kind that said she had been waiting for this. "Hey," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual, as if this wasn't the most reckless thing he had done in a long time. "Hey," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. The guy next to her looked between them, confused but not hostile. He wasn't staking any claim. He didn't need to. There was an awkward pause, and he realized he had no idea what he was doing. He hadn't planned anything past getting up and walking over. So, he started, then stopped, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't expect to run into you here." She gave a small nod, not really reacting, and that should have been his first warning. The girl he used to know would have filled the silence, asked him how he'd been, tried to smooth over the tension. But she wasn't doing that, because she didn't owe him that anymore. "Yeah," she said after a beat. "It's been a while." The guy beside her glanced at his phone, then at her. "I'll go grab our drinks," he said, standing up. He didn't look at him like a rival, didn't seem threatened. He didn't need to be. And somehow, that made everything worse. When they were alone, he finally exhaled. "So how have you been?" She studied him for a second, and he felt that same shift from before, the unshakable feeling that he was standing in front of someone he should have known better, but somehow didn't recognize at all. "I've been good," she said simply. "Good. Not, I've missed you. Not, it's weird seeing you again. Just good." And suddenly, the weight of everything settled in his chest. He had waited too long. He had spent months believing she'd always be there, believing he had time. But time had moved on, and so had she. "You look happy," he said, before he could stop himself. It wasn't meant as a compliment. It was an observation, A realization. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. I am. That was it. 2 words. No hesitation. No uncertainty. He swallowed, the noise of the cafe fading around them. He wanted to say something, anything to break through whatever wall had formed between them. To remind her of what they used to be, to make her second-guess whatever path she had chosen without him. But she wasn't second-guessing. And that was the part that hurt the most. The guy returned with their drinks, setting hers down in front of her. She smiled at him, really smiled, and when she turned back to him, there was something final in her expression. It was good seeing you, she said, her voice warm but firm. That was his cue. The moment where he was supposed to smile, nod, and walk away. But his feet didn't move. His chest felt too tight, his mind racing through all the things he could say, all the things he should have said a long time ago. But before he could find the words, she turned back to her coffee, her attention shifting away, leaving him standing there like he was nothing more than a memory she had already made peace with. And for the first time, he felt what she must have felt all those times before. The feeling of being the one left behind. He walked out of the cafe, but the feeling in his chest didn't leave with him. The air felt colder, the streets louder, but inside, all he could hear was her voice, calm, steady, unbothered. She had moved on. That much was clear. But what wasn't clear, what kept gnawing at him, was why she reached out in the first place. If she was done, if she had made peace with everything, then what was the point of sending that first message? What did she want from him? Or maybe the real question was, what did he want from her? That thought followed him home, clinging to him like a shadow. He didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way she smiled at that guy, the way she spoke like she owed him nothing. And for the first time, he had to wonder, was there something she wasn't telling him? The next day, he found himself scrolling through old messages, reading conversations he hadn't looked at in months. Back then, he had never really listened to what she was saying. But now, with everything shifted, the words hit differently. There was one conversation in particular that stuck out. The last time she had tried to talk about where things were going, where they were going. I feel like I'm waiting for something that's never going to happen. You're overthinking. Maybe. But maybe I'm finally seeing things clearly. He had brushed it off then, confident she'd always be there. But now, he couldn't help but feel like that moment had been the beginning of the end. She had already been slipping away, and he had been too blind to notice. And now, maybe she wanted him to see it, to understand what it felt like to be left behind. The thought bothered him more than it should have. Hours passed, and eventually, he gave in. He pulled out his phone, hesitating only for a second before typing a message. I don't get it. If you were done with me, why did you reach out? He stared at the screen, wondering if he should send it, if he should just let it go. But his pride, his frustration, maybe even something deeper pushed him forward. He hit send. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No response. It wasn't until later that night, just as he was about to give up, that his phone buzzed. Her reply was short. Meet me tomorrow. I'll explain. His heart pounded as he read it again. Explain what and why did it feel like everything he thought he knew was about to change? He barely slept that night. His mind kept circling back to her message, turning over every possibility, every hidden meaning behind her words. I'll explain what was there to explain. She had made it clear she had moved on. She wasn't waiting for him anymore. So why did it feel like there was something she still needed to say by the time the morning light crept through his window? He had played out 100 different scenarios in his head. None of them prepared him for the moment he actually saw her again. She was already sitting at the cafe when he arrived, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea, her gaze distant. She looked up as he walked in, and for a brief second, something flickered across her face. Something that made his chest tighten. This wasn't just another conversation. He slid into the seat across from her, feeling more nervous than he wanted to admit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she sighed, setting her cup down. "I owe you the truth," she said. His pulse kicked up. "About what?" She hesitated, as if deciding where to start. "When I messaged you, it wasn't because I wanted to get back in touch. It wasn't about us. That stung more than it should have," but he stayed quiet. "I reached out because I needed to know if I was really over it." "Over you?" She paused, searching his face for something. "And now I know I am." The words hit like a slow, sinking weight in his chest. He had expected a confrontation, maybe even an argument. But this quiet certainty, it felt more final than anything else she could have said. He swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Then why ask me to meet you?" she exhaled, as if she had been holding something in. "Because I wanted to say goodbye properly. And I wanted to tell you something." A strange tension settled between them. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever she was about to say, but he nodded anyway. She glanced down at her hands before looking back up. "For the longest time, I thought you were the one in control, that you were the one deciding how things went between us. And I let myself believe that if I just waited long enough, you'd see me the way I wanted you to." She shook her head, a small, almost sad smile on her lips. "But you never did. And the truth is, I don't think you ever will." He opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand. "I'm not blaming you. I let it happen. But I'm done letting it happen." There it was. The real reason she had called him here. Not for closure, at least. Not for him. This was for her. This was her reclaiming her own story. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "So that's it? You just needed to make sure you were over me." She studied him for a long moment. "I think you needed to know that more than I did." The words sank in, and suddenly, he understood. She hadn't reached out to test her own feelings. She had reached out to show him what it felt like to be left behind. To be the one wondering, waiting, and she was right. He had spent so long assuming she'd always be there, that she'd always want him. But now, sitting across from her, he finally saw the truth. She had been the one with the power all along. She just hadn't realized it until now. He let out a breath, nodding slowly. "I guess I deserved that." She smiled, not out of pity, not out of regret, just a quiet understanding. "Maybe. But this isn't about revenge. It's about moving on." Something about the way she said it made him believe her. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He just accepted it. He glanced toward the window, watching as people passed by outside, moving forward just like she was. When he looked back at her, she was already standing, slipping her bag over her shoulder. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. And then, without hesitation, she walked away. This time, he didn't follow. He just watched her go, feeling the weight of everything settle inside him. Maybe in the end, she had been waiting for something. Not for him, but for the moment she could finally walk away without looking back. And now, that moment had come. For both of them, he sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty chair across from him. The cafe buzzed around him, people coming and going, conversations blending into the background, but none of it reached him. She was gone, and not in the way she had been before, when there was still that unspoken pull between them. This time, there was no more waiting, no more hoping. She had walked away, and she wasn't looking back. It should have been a relief in some way. At least now, there was no more uncertainty, no more pretending that she was just one text away if he ever changed his mind. But instead of relief, all he felt was the weight of everything he hadn't said when he had the chance. He reached for his phone out of habit, scrolling through their old messages one last time before locking the screen. He had nothing left to say, nothing that would change what had already happened. For the first time in a long time, he had to accept that some things don't get second chances. Days passed, then weeks. The first few felt strange, like something was missing. He caught himself expecting to hear from her, even though he knew better. He walked past places they used to go, only to realize they didn't feel the same anymore. At first, he wanted to believe it was just an adjustment period. That soon, he'd move on, just like she had. But the more time passed, the more he understood he wasn't just missing her. He was coming to terms with the version of himself that had let her slip away. That was the hardest part. One night, he found himself back at the cafe. Not because he was expecting to see her, he knew she wouldn't be there, but because he needed to close this chapter in his own way. He ordered a coffee and sat at a table by the window, watching the city move around him. He thought about everything that had led them here. All the choices, all the moments where he had taken her for granted. And then, finally, he let it go. She had been right about one thing: this wasn't about getting back what they had lost. It was about learning from it. About realizing that love isn't something you put on hold, expecting it to be there whenever it's convenient for you. He had spent so much time believing she'd always be waiting, never once considering that she might learn to stop. And now, she had. He took a slow breath and picked up his phone. But instead of opening their old messages, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He sent a message to someone else. Someone he had been meaning to catch up with, but had always put off. Someone he had assumed would always be there, just like he had assumed she would be. This time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. He didn't expect to hear back right away. And that was okay. Because for the first time, he wasn't waiting. He was moving forward too.